Welcome back, everybody. This is our last lecture for the second unit. We'll be finishing up the remaining visual elements and moving on to design principles. So, quick review, things we've already covered. Remember, line is our most basic visual element, and its most important function is defining boundaries and edges, basically showing the outside edge of a shape. We talked a little bit about shape and mass. Remember that mass is the three-dimensional equivalent of shape. We'll look a little bit more at that today as well. But essentially a line enclosing an area creates a two-dimensional shape. And we also talked, of course, about positive and negative shape. The idea of the positive being the area that is filled, the subject or object, the figure, and the negative space being the empty space, the foreground or background kind of surrounding that. We talked specifically about spatial illusions of overlapping, diminishing size, placement in the picture plane. We also talked quite a lot about linear perspective, 1-point and 2-point perspective systems. 1 point would be a situation when you are parallel to or facing the object that you're looking at. If you are in a 2-point situation, you're facing a corner and both sides are moving away from you in space. We talked about the use of value, the idea of using hatching or cross-hatching or stippling or flat areas of tone to create relative changes between the whitest of the paper to the absolute darkest mark you could make. Generally speaking, value is really the visual element that is responsible for creating believable three-dimensional illusions more so than just outline. We all talk quite a lot about color vocabulary. Primaries are red, yellow, blue. They are a color triad equally spaced apart from one another on the color wheel. Another color triad is the secondary colors, orange, green, and violet, or what we sometimes call purple. The secondaries are made by mixing two quantities. So red plus yellow equals orange, yellow plus blue equals green, red plus blue equals violet. Your tertiaries or intermediary colors are secondaries that have more of one primary in the mixture. So an orange that has more red would be called red orange. So we have red orange, yellow orange, we have blue green, yellow green, and we have red violet and blue violet. The primaries constitute one color triad, the secondaries constitute a second triad, the tertiaries actually contain two triads for a total of 12 colors that we looked at in our analysis of the color wheel. We talked about color schemes, monochromatic being tints and shades of a single color, analogous color scheme being the use of colors that are side by one another on the color wheel. We talked about a complementary color scheme being colors that are directly opposite, such as red, green, yellow, violet, and blue, orange. And a triadic color scheme would be the use of colors that are equally spaced on the color wheel, a triad like the primaries or the secondaries. We talked about the color effect of simultaneous contrast when using complementary colors that created the after image effect that we saw. We talked about saturation or intensity and how we can change the saturation by adding white or black or by mixing complements together. Tints and shades are really important terms for us to be aware of. A tint is a hue, the base color, plus white, and a shade is the base hue plus black to make the color darker, but those also make them less intense. So things we haven't looked at yet that are considered visual elements: texture, pattern, and the idea of time and motion. With texture, we can have actual physical texture, although more often we'll be looking at the illusion or simulation of texture, what we can just simply call visual texture. Pattern, I get kind of picky with this one. Pattern, especially if you are in the design industry, if you're doing fabric design, wallpaper design, clothing, pattern refers to a regular repeating plan. And the unit that repeats is sometimes called the motif, but in the industry, in the design industry, no one really uses that term anymore. The element that repeats, they simply call the repeat. I prefer to use the term motif to refer to a repetition of similar elements. An image that has lots of different flowers in it but does not produce a regular repeating pattern would be an example of a use of a motif. The concept of time and motion is definitely important for us. With visual art, a lot of times we try to suggest movement or the passage of time. We also have some work that does, in fact, take time to look at, sequential animation, just as one example. And of course, there are objects, sculptures in particular, that are able to move. So an important visual element vocab term for us there is kinetic. Static implies something that can't move. A kinetic piece is able to move. So when we look at the illusion of texture, these are some of my favorite examples to pull because they are so detailed and they almost feel photographically real. When you look closer at them, you see more and more and more detail. You have a Renaissance painting on the left by Hans Holbein. You've got a painting from France from roughly 1850-ish by the painter Rosa Bonheur. She is a realist painter with a capital R. She's one of the French realists. Both are masters at creating in oil paint the believable illusion that you are looking at different textures, different types of fabric, hair, skin, wood, metal, and in fact, the closer you get to these paintings in some respects, the more believable they are. I wanted you to see this painting in contrast to the last two. With this one, you definitely get the suggestion that the floor in this painting would be rough wood. But you can also tell, I think, this is a really high quality scan of this painting. What you're looking at is paint that's applied so thickly that you can see the texture of the paint itself. So in this case, we have not only the illusion of texture, the visual texture of the rough floor, for instance, but we have the actual texture of the paint itself. An important term for us with this is the term impasto. When paint is applied really, really thickly, we refer to a thickly painted area as a use of impasto. Obviously, with sculpture, you're going to have the actual physical texture of the material to consider as well. These are pieces by the Italian Renaissance sculptor Donatello. He's an early Renaissance sculptor from the city of Florence. The image on the left is carved from stone, and the image on the right is carved from wood. So he's able to take these two different materials, very hard materials, and create the illusion of hair, fabric, fur, skin, metal. It's kind of amazing that he's able to achieve this illusion with these materials that would not feel like those things to touch. Obviously, the stone area of the carving that is meant to look like the cape that the figure is wearing, it would still feel like stone, but it looks like it is fabric. It's really amazing to consider that an artist would be able to manipulate a material and create the illusion that you're seeing something completely different. Obviously, these are slightly more contemporary examples. You may be familiar with the sculpture known as Cloudgate in the city of Chicago. That piece, sometimes nicknamed the Bean, has an incredibly highly polished mirrored surface that doesn't really show any material working or seam of any kind. It's completely smooth, versus the object on the left, which is in fact the title of the piece is Object, by a female surrealist painter, Merit Oppenheim. It is actually a three-dimensional sculpture, teacup and spoon and saucer, created from fur, from hair. So obviously the illusion here in a way is that you're supposed the smooth porcelain metal that you would expect, and instead you see this texture that's completely alien to that. Also a physical texture, if you were to touch it, you would feel the fur itself. somewhat of an extra credit kind of concept, I wanted to pull in one more approach to the idea of texture. We also sometimes refer to this idea of invented texture. And in both cases, these are paintings by Roy Lichtenstein. We've looked at a couple pieces already, but Lichtenstein is a pop artist, and he intentionally imitated the appearance of comic books in his work. And so you're seeing here things that obviously are not meant to trick your eye. They're not meant to fool you into thinking that you actually see real texture. Created a sense of texture by creating more or less a motif of lines or dots. Like this obviously is meant to create the illusion of wood grain, but it's not a convincing visual illusion the way the paintings that we started with would be. Also, this one I really quite like, because over here in the bread you have these series of stippled dots that kind of create the idea of the air pockets in a piece of toasted bread, but that is also the exact same mark that he uses over here in this glass of soda, in this case are meant to imitate the idea of carbonated bubbles in a carbonated beverage. So clearly he is using the same type of texture or same type of mark to imitate or to create the idea of two different textures, hence invented. A technique that we associate quite often with Picasso and also with different artists who rely more on combining different elements together is the idea of collage. Collage is cut and pasted paper or other flat-ish materials. But the reason I wanted you to see this particular collage by Picasso is that it contains an illusion of texture. That wood grain is actually wallpaper that he cut and pasted, so it tries to really create the illusion of wood. But the background of this piece, the base of it, is also wallpaper, and that wallpaper has a regular repeating pattern in it. That diamond shape, which I've pulled out for you here, repeats over and over again to the left, to the right, above, and below. That is what I would refer to as a regular repeating pattern. And the element of that diamond shape is the part that repeats. And so we'll refer to that unit as the repeat. These are repeating patterns by MCA. Couple examples of his impossible perspective illusions, which are so cool. This is another design idea that he's really famous for. Escher is really well known for the creation of repeating patterns known as tessellations. In a tessellation, the shape that the pattern is made from, the repeating unit, the repeat itself, is actually what into itself to create these repeated patterns. It's more obvious, I think, in the example of the fish. If you really look at the shape of one bone, if you look right here at the tail, for instance, you can see that four tails all come together at that point. And the shape of this fish rotates and fits exactly into this blue, and then into the green, and then into the black. So those patterns repeat precisely. Tessellations can be really challenging to make, but they're a basic idea to understand. If you take a geometric shape, preferably a square or a rectangle, and start with that as your base unit, if you take a section out, for instance, cut a small triangle from the bottom edge and a small triangle from the right-hand edge, if you take those pieces you've cut out and attach them directly across from where they, so taking the clip from the right, moving it to the left, taking the clip from the bottom and moving it to the top, you create this new shape that, if you repeat it, will interlock and repeat into itself. So by manipulating these types of shapes, you could start trying to imagine them as different illusions of organic objects, animals or people, and the more that you manipulate it, the more sophisticated your illusion can become. A rotating tessellation is a pretty fun game to play with a square or a rectangle in this clip and applying it not directly across, but at a 90-degree from where it originated. And so now this would fit inside of itself. When you see it in this orientation, that simple shape that I made could easily become some kind of a shark. It's got a fin and a mouth that he sort of suggested. So the more that you play with these images, that you could possibly come up with something as complex as what Escher was able to do. Some examples by Cape Fear students that are pretty sophisticated, but are made from essentially simple square and rectangle formats. Another aspect of the visual language of art, or visual elements in art, includes the suggestion of motion. So in both of these pieces, there's a suggestion of space and movement, even though these paintings are completely flat. These are both by a British artist named Riley, who is perhaps the best known artist in the world for a style that emerged in the 1960s called op art, a shortened version of optical illusion. And so the image on the left is my personal favorite of the two, because it kind of looks as if you're looking at printed dots on pages in a book. If you've ever opened a really, really thick book, like a dictionary or Bible, you may notice when you get to the middle that the text seems to get smaller the closer you get to the part of the page that's attached in the binding into the spine. And so this creates a feeling of three-dimensionality in that painting. You can also see that the shape has to change to create that. They go from flat circles to ovals, and she's also changed the value to create the sense that there's a highlight on that section. I would argue that that then makes this painting not have a regular pattern, because the shapes, of course, change from circle to. This is another great example of art trying to tackle this idea of motion, and why that's important is something that's worth thinking about too. I mean, paintings, sculptures, they're finished, really can't change. And for the most part, they don't move. And yet they're trying to make statements, to make us have ideas or emotions about the world around us that is full of things that move all the time. So how can you capture that sense of life in something that's completely static, that's completely still? So early 20th century called Futurism began in Italy, and this is a great futurist painting by Giacomo Balla, and it shows a human being walking a dog on a city street, and you see the dog's on a leash. The leash is repeated about 4 times. I love the fact that because the dog has really short legs, of course, compared to the person, that if you really start counting, you can see like dozens of dog compared to about a half dozen human feet in the same space. Well, of course, the dog's having to move its legs and feet much, much at a faster rate than the human is because of their relative change in size. The repetition of the shape of the tail, ears, shoes, etc., begins to make this feel as if the painting is not just capturing 1 nanosecond time, but it's capturing several seconds as these figures move across space. Even the sidewalk that they're walking on has been painted to appear blurred or streaked. If you've ever accidentally taken a photograph with your cell phone while the phone in motion, you get this kind of strange distorted blur effect. It's really kind of an interesting way of showing movement. This is another member futurist movement. This is an artist whose name is Boccioni. Boccioni's painting here also attempts to capture the idea of noise. The title is "The Noise of the Street Invades the House." This person is standing on a balcony looking down into the street, essentially, and you can see all this activity and movement and noise happening through these repeated and overlapped shapes. Another piece by Boccioni, and in fact it's 2 different castings of the same sculpture, which is why the color is a little different in these 2. But what you're seeing on the left is a profile view, and on the right is a head-on view of a cast metal sculpture that Boccioni made that forms of continuity in space. And it's meant to really look like a person walking probably very quickly or into a stiff wind. And I think those of us who've lived in a hurricane zone for a while know that feeling of wind blowing against your clothing and billowing it back as you move into that stiff wind. But it also suggests the idea of the leg moving into 2 or 3 different positions as the body forward. So here's a great example of a sculpture that cannot move itself, but suggests the human body and suggests movement in space. Now, this piece is not the most exciting example of art in the world, but it's by an artist named George Rickey, and Rickey really was well known for sculptures that were hinged and physically then were able to move because of the movement of air. So the photos that you're seeing are of the same sculpture at 2 different sort of spindly triangular shapes will move back and forth as air moves across that surface and causes them to react, almost the way the tree sways in the wind. Pretty cool. This is a maybe even more famous, certainly more famous, as Alexander Calder. And Calder's pieces he categorized into 2 big categories. He had a category called mobiles, which were the pieces that could move, that didn't move stabiles. The example that you're seeing here, all 3 of these pieces, they're quite large, and they do react almost like sails on a sailboat. They move because air movement pushes against them and it causes them to spin and to rotate. So definitely kinetic sculptures. Perhaps one of the more famous recent kinetic pieces, and it's kind of fascinating to see these, but the strand beasts are really kind of amazing works by Theo Jansen, and he's done a pretty well-known TED talk about these pieces. He's actually more of a scientist and engineer than a visual artist, but his works literally respond to the space that they're in. These strand beasts, in particular the beach ones, can detect whether behind them is wet or dry, and they will literally move to higher ground to escape the wet so they don't get washed out to sea. They're really kind of amazing to see in motion, but they literally do move. Another way of creating a sense of passage of time is this example from the Renaissance by a painter named Masaccio. Masaccio is telling a story with a beginning, middle, and end, all in one image. It's all seemingly happening at once. This is a story from the book of Matthew in which Christ and the disciples are confronted by a Roman tax collector. The tax collector wants them to pay their taxes, obviously, but they've given their money to the poor. So Christ asks to go fishing, and Peter obeys, and he goes fishing. When he opens the mouth of the fish that he catches, he discovers gold coins that they need to pay the taxes. So the story is told slightly out of sequence. The center is actually the beginning. You see the tax talking to Christ, and you see Christ giving his instructions to Peter. You see Peter a second time in the middle part of the story over here, catching the fish and opening its mouth. And then you see Peter a third time paying the tax collector at the end of the story. So it actually is almost like one panel of a comic book or comic strip that tells 3 points in time simultaneously. It's kind of a cool idea. Speaking of sequential art, one of the most successful graphic novels in history of that art form is the book Mouse, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 1992. And it reads very much, or looks very much, like a traditional kind of comic style. But the idea here, of course, is telling a story that takes place over a sequence of, in this case, years. Idea behind Mouse was that Spiegelman interviewed his own grandfather about his experience in a Nazi concentration camp. And so he then illustrated his grandfather's story, but again, trying not to dwell so much on the horrific aspects in terms of making drawings that would be too hard or too difficult for us to be able to spend time with. He made this really interesting decision to make the Jews in the concentration camp into mice, and the Nazis are depicted this kind of cartoon animal. Disconnect between them causes us to feel the animosity and to feel the threat from one group to the other, but also makes it somewhat more palatable for us to be able, or gives us that distance actually gave us when we looked at the Guernica piece, to be able to confront these horrifying stories and spend time with them, instead of how difficult it would be to see them if they were photographs or paintings that looked very much like the real. It's kind of a fascinating way of allowing us to understand or digest this type of rare narrative. Okay, so our design principles. We've talked a lot about how the visual elements, line, shape, value, color, texture, etc. work. Now this is how we kind of put all of them together. So design for our purpose about how to make effective compositions, how to arrange all the elements of our artwork to make it look its absolute best. So the basic design ideas we need to be aware of are balance, focal point, scale and proportion, which are issues of size, repetition, and then these two overriding principles, unity and variety. So start with balance. We've already looked at this diagram before about the idea of visual weight, and we talked about how a large light shape is heavier than a small of the same color or value, and how similar sized things can be made to feel heavier or lighter. Darker and textured tend to feel lighter than heavier rather than a light colored shape of the same size. Placement can give us that weight. Lower feels heavier than higher. But we talked about this concept a lot, the idea of balance, that a couple small things could balance a large thing, or that one smaller, darker thing could balance a larger. These are the kind of issues we want to think about with visual weight that help us to create this sense of balance in our artwork. Now, obviously, we're going to be drawn to symmetry. I mean, when you look head on at a human face, for the most part, our faces are pretty symmetrical. And symmetry is very pleasing to the eye. Now, it may be a little obvious for us that this is a simple way to organize. They get a little repetitive even. So often when teaching artists, we talk to them about this issue. It's not that symmetry is bad, and here are two examples of great pieces of art by famous artists that basically rely on symmetrical composition. It's not that it's bad, it's just that it is perhaps the easy way out. Take a look at these examples. The type of painting that we refer to in Italian Renaissance art as the sacred conversation, on a throne holding Christ as a child, flanked on either side by angels and saints. We call that a sacred conversation, or a sacra conversazione. And that style of altarpiece painting was prevalent throughout the Middle Ages into the early and high Renaissance in Italy. And you see here easily a dozen examples of essentially the same painting, right? And as beautiful as they are, and as much absolutely identical one to the other, they are a pretty basic, obvious format for arranging the composition. So symmetry can get a little boring. In interior design, it's not that it doesn't look good. The examples on this slide on the left are very symmetrical. However, it could be a little rigid, and so the examples on the right give you that idea of using asymmetrical balance, something larger being balanced by a couple of smaller things does tend to be a little more sensibility. So here are some artworks that give us an idea of balance. They don't feel heavier on one side than the other, but they're not symmetrical. So we call this type of balance asymmetrical balance. And we looked at that already with this big couple small things balancing a large, or a small dark balancing a large. We've seen this if we think of it like a teeter-totter of scales and then apply it to the visual world, then you can see in this example we've got a couple small shapes that are darker balanced pretty light large shape. We've got this example of a pretty large space that has very little detail in it balancing with a lot of detail. We have this example of smaller darker balancing a larger shape. So it's kind of interesting to think about how we can create a feeling of balance without having to rely on absolute symmetry. Some artists will use radial symmetry, in which images are balanced, radiating out equally weighted objects, radiating outward from center. Piece is actually a painting called The Seven Deadly Sins, and this panel right here is gluttony, so you can see that people are overeating and indulging in that painting. It's kind of funny. This piece is a ceiling painting. You're meant to look up at it, and it creates a 1-point perspective of depth and has quite a bit of foreshortening and these funny little naked Cupid babies. But it also is centrally focused, that there's about the same amount of weight radiating outward from that center point all the way around. Radial balance. Trying to the viewer's attention is something we've all talked about. We talked about it with line, implied line, and with value. These are all ways of directing our attention to the focal point, whatever that may be. Now, the focal point might be in the center, as it is in the Last Supper, and we've got implied lines not only the faces looking at Christ, but of the perspective lines, or orthogonals, leading us to the vanishing point, which is at Christ's head. A less centric focal point is right here. Your eye goes immediately to this area, which is lit almost like a spotlight in this painting by Caravaggio. The characters are all looking inward. This is a pretty intense painting in which Christ appears to his disciples after the crucifixion and his death and entombment, and so they don't quite believe that he could really have returned from the dead, and so he shows the spear wound in his side, a painting known as the Doubting Thomas, as Thomas literally touches the wound to be able to believe in this miracle. This example is a good way of seeing a focal point, in this case two focal areas. Obviously, as people, we're going to be drawn to image human beings, but also here, because the figures are stark white and roughly textured, they are in extreme contrast dark surfaces around them. When we talk about size, we have to think about two issues: proportion and scale. So with scale, what we're really seeing here are things that are the way you would expect them to look in terms of proportion, but they are at a much larger size than normal. So these are pieces by Claes Oldenburg, who's a very famous sculptor, well known. Everyday objects that are normally small-ish handheld things, a spoon or a handsaw, at an enormous scale, so big that they are many, many times larger than they would be in normal life. Proportion, though, is about the relative measure of size of one part of an object in comparison to its overall size. So, for instance, we talked the proportions used in ancient Greek statues, that they devised an ideal system of proportions for the overall height of the body based on the height of the head, and they came up with a 7-unit system where the size of the skull from chin to the top of the skull would equal the overall height. Da Vinci also is one of many Renaissance artists to explore the ideas that were espoused by an architect named Vitruvius. And Vitruvius believed that architecture should have its proportions or sizes based on the proportions of the human body. And so one of the studies that Leonardo did, and in fact many other artists drew similar designs to this, became known as the Vitruvian Man in honor of Vitruvius. And it shows you that the human height, if you're standing at your extended height, is the same as your arm span. If you extend your arms out at a perfect 90-degree angle to your body, the tips of your longest fingers from end to end should equal your height. And that is inscribed then, of course, in a square, because the square is the same in height as it is. He also shows us, though, that if our arms and legs are splayed in this kind of X shape, that they would fit within the center of that circle would then point toward your navel. The center of the square, though, if we connect opposite corners, the center of the square would be just above the pubic area. So he's showing us this perfect human proportion of a square and a circle. And in fact, there are several studies that have been done. Here is one of the photograph that I was able to find online of students trying to measure their own bodies using this Vitruvian proportion system, and it comes out to be pretty darn accurate. Fun to think about. We definitely can see the seven-head system here in this ancient Greek statue of Poseidon, and you can see how those proportions would help you to use this concept of what is one unit or one portion of the body to measure out other units. Well, there are other proportional rules at play here. Not only do we have the 7 heads tall, we also have a system of ratios of 1 unit to the overall units. This unit of one section, the shoulder to the elbow versus elbow to the fully extended finger, gives a proportion of 1 to 1.618. Thing from head to navel versus navel to the fully extended foot, 1 to 1.618, which is the same proportion that you see in this diagram. What's fascinating about this is known as the golden ratio, or golden section, or the golden rectangle. It's a rectangular form in which if we cut a perfect square out of that rectangle, we're left with a rectangular section that is the same proportion as its original shape, but smaller. And you keep doing that, cutting a square out, leaving a rectangle, cutting a rectangle. And if you connect those opposite corners of those square units, you create this perfect spiral found throughout nature. You can find it in nautilus shells, in the growth patterns of plants, particularly sunflower, really easy to see it. And the ancient Greeks used this proportional system or ratio in their architecture and in their sculpture as well. It's really kind of fascinating to see how many things in the natural world, the pattern of hurricanes, the spiral of galaxies, actually fall within or very close this absolutely perfect system. You may be familiar with the Fibonacci sequence. It's a numerical sequence that fits the same pattern. So repetition, we definitely see visual artists using this tool to create a sense of movement or to create movement for eyes across the surface of a painting. You can see that there's a kind of chaotic movement from left to right across the backs of horses in the Rosa Bonheur painting. But your eye also kind of follows a rhythm of the windows across the painting of hoppers at the bottom there as well. Definitely want to think about the reasons why we pay so much attention to how elements are used, because we want visual art to be interesting to look at. No one is going to spend enough time looking at to get your message across if the piece is boring. So in example A there, you've got a very, very unified design. It's all straight lines and geometric right-angled shapes. It's all rectangles and squares, and it can be a little dull. On the other hand, you've got C on the far right-hand side, an example that's got curves and angles, straight lines, and circles and ovals. And there's so much going on that it may be too chaotic for some people. So what we're trying to aim for most of the middle ground, letter B, which is unified, but with enough variety that you've got some visual interest. You don't want to have too much unity probably in any aspect of your life. If you dressed in all exactly the same colors head to toe with no variation anywhere, that might be boring. If you spoke in a monotone, it would be very boring, but it would be very unified. You need some variation, some pause, and some that feels more human, right? So we always try in our art to make sure that there is unity, that it goes together, but that there's some variety so it's not completely boring. This example is a painting from the German Expressionist era. It's a piece of Ludwig Kerr, and Kirchner was the leader of a group of artists known as De Bruyne, which means the bridge, and they believed that the bridge between art and nature and between us and the future. They really believed they were showing art. And they relied a lot on geometric shapes and hard edges, and you can see that throughout this painting. The way the people are painted has a lot of sharp, hard-edged geometric emphasis. There's not a lot of curves in there, really. He's also unified the piece by using mostly purples into blues. They're analogous colors. They all kind of fit in together in mostly cool-ish range. But the especially to me is this white and black area of this newspaper that he's pointing at. The painting is hilarious to me because this is Kirchner. These are his other artist friends. He is slapping his hand against this newspaper to prove to them that he is the founder of their movement, and he's pointing at an article in a newspaper that says that. The funny thing is he made this painting over 10 years after the group had stopped working together, so he's still trying to prove his point a decade later. Kind of funny. Here's a piece that has, again, a great sense of unity. All of these elements seem almost identical. It's a piece by a Polish sculptor named Magdalena Abakanowicz, and she very often confronted issues of mortality, death, and war in her work, and that is entirely fitting. I think she was born in 1930, so she was very young during the Second World War, and she saw a lot of pain and suffering up close because of the place she was born. So a lot of her work addresses this idea of mortality, of death. And you see that in this image from the back. If you're looking at the installation of the piece, it's collectively known as backs. They do look like beings, obviously, but they also sort of reference the shape of tombstones. And at first glance, they all look identical, but in that photograph, you can see just slightly different color, slightly different position, slightly different texture. So they have unifying elements. None of them are solid. They're all hollowed out. They don't have heads. They have partial arms and legs, and they're in the same pose. All of that unifies the piece, and yet they're not each exactly identical. And I think that's very much her point. It says a lot about humanity. We are visually identical, and yet we all suffer in similar ways. You could very easily see that part of this piece is about difference in skin color, right? It's a compelling visual reminder that there's so much that we have in common, that these surface differences are very, very slight in some respects. This is a great example of using the approach of putting tons of variety in. This piece has every color in the rainbow and some colors that are super shiny silver, right? But it also needs a unifying element because it has so much variety going on, it could be overwhelming. So what you as the piece is the repetition of the arm and face combination across that surface. It's a really important thing to be aware of in making art, that we need both unity and variety. Too much of either could be bad. Too much unity is boring. Too much is overwhelming. So pieces that have a lot of stress of the unifying element need something to relieve it, need some variety. Artworks that have a ton of variety in color, texture, shape need some unifying aspect to keep it from being visually overwhelming.